I was the head of legal compliance at Varian Analytics, 45 years old, and for 9 years, I built a reputation on precision. My life was defined by the lines of contracts, by the small, often overlooked clauses that held entire deals together. So when the $2.5 billion buyout wad came across my desk, the biggest deal in the company's history, I knew my signature was the final, non-negotiable authorization. I found a footnote, a tiny detail that hid a massive liability, and I refused to sign. I didn't raise my voice. I just stated the truth. 2 days later, they walked me out of the office in front of everyone, right before the deal was supposed to close. They thought I was gone. They were wrong. So if you're watching this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels, and if something in you recognizes something in this, stay with me. I am Eleanor Vance, 45 years old, and for the past 9 years, I have served as the head of legal compliance at Varian Analytics. My professional life was built on an unwavering dedication to precision, and my meticulous attention to detail made me the last gatekeeper for the company's most critical transactions. My value lay in the silent, relentless work of ensuring every document was ironclad. Every risk was accounted for. This $2.5 billion buyout, a monumental acquisition by a global conglomerate, was the culmination of everything Varian had worked for. My signature was the final, non-negotiable authorization required to seal this colossal deal. I had spent weeks reviewing drafts, cross-referencing clauses, and flagging potential issues. But during my final pass, my eyes snagged on something subtly sinister. It was a footnote, discreetly placed deep within Appendix C, so minuscule it almost dissolved into the page margins. Its content, however, was anything but trivial. It referenced a historical liability, a dormant lawsuit from years ago, that if reactivated by the acquisition's terms, could cost the acquiring billionaire's firm hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a ticking time bomb, ingeniously disguised, and my signature, in its current form, would legitimize it, thereby directly transferring Varian's past negligence onto the new owners. My immediate reaction wasn't anger, but a chilling, crystal-clear recognition of a profound misalignment. This was no oversight. It was a deliberate omission, a calculated risk taken by someone who desperately hoped it would pass unnoticed in the 11th hour rush. The audacity of it was almost impressive, if not for the ethical lines it so flagrantly crossed. I picked up my phone and dialed Gavin Lee's direct line. He was Varian's newly appointed Chief Executive Officer, a man whose ambition was as palpable as his perfectly tailored suits. He answered, his voice already taut with the pressure of closing this landmark deal. I laid it out for him, calmly, precisely, referencing the exact page and line. I explained the implications, the legal exposure, the ethical breach. There was a long, drawn-out beat of silence on his end, thick with unspoken irritation. He cleared his throat. Eleanor, he began, attempting a practiced blend of charm and authority. We're on a critically tight schedule here. This is the 11th hour. We've had a dozen legal teams look at this. Are you absolutely certain this isn't just standard due diligence? I reiterated my findings, my voice remaining level, devoid of emotional inflection. Gavin, this is unequivocally not standard. This is a material liability that has been artfully obscured. My signature on this document in its current form would be a profound dereliction of my duty, not only to Varian, but ethically to the acquiring party. It simply must be amended, or that clause removed before I can authorize this deal. He tried every tactic, cajoling, then escalating to direct pressure, mentioning the board, the investors, the disastrous optics of any last-minute delays. His voice grew colder, the polished facade cracking to reveal an impatient edge of frustration. I held firm. My professional integrity wasn't up for negotiation, and certainly not for the sake of obscuring a hidden footnote that could cost billions. He ended the call abruptly. I slowly hung up the phone, the receiver feeling unusually heavy in my hand. In that silent finality, I knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had shifted. They wanted this deal, at any cost. and it had just become chillingly clear that, in their eyes, I was the unforeseen, inconvenient, and now expendable cost. The next 2 days hung heavy with an unsettling quiet. Gavin never called back. That silence wasn't reassuring. It was a calculated calm before an inevitable storm. I knew Gavin, impatient, driven, and utterly ruthless when his ambition was challenged. My refusal to sign the $20.5 billion contract had thrown a massive wrench into his plans, and he wouldn't simply accept it. Friday morning arrived, marked by the final signing meeting. It was a high-stakes gathering with the acquiring conglomerate's legal team, their chief executive officer, and our own Virion board members. The air in the executive conference room crackled with nervous energy, a mix of excitement and anticipation. Colleagues buzzed with whispers about the colossal acquisition, the expected bonuses, the promised future. I took my usual seat, a quiet observer of the unfolding scene. Precisely at 9 a.m., Gavin strode in, his presence immediately commanding silence. He wasn't alone. Behind him, our head of human resources followed, her face unusually grim. Gavin's eyes swept across the room, acknowledging everyone but me. He approached the main table, his gaze fixed on the acquiring team's CEO, offering no pleasantries. Instead, he simply nodded to the head of human resources. She stepped forward, a thick white envelope clutched in her hand. My heart gave a small, almost imperceptible lurch. I knew that envelope. I'd seen them delivered before, though never in such a public setting. She walked directly to my side of the table, her eyes avoiding mine. Her voice, though low, carried clearly in the suddenly hushed room. "Eleanor," she began, her tone carefully neutral, "due to unforeseen structural changes and a necessary reevaluation of departmental needs, your position as head of legal compliance has been eliminated, effective immediately. This is part of a broader organizational restructuring." The words hung in the air, cold and clinical. Eliminated. Restructuring. No one moved, no one spoke. My colleagues' faces, moments ago alight with excitement, were now frozen in shock. The acquiring team's CEO, a formidable woman, watched Gavin with a narrowed gaze, her expression unreadable. This wasn't a private conversation. It was a public dismissal, designed to humiliate me, to strip away my authority and integrity in one swift, brutal stroke. Gavin then stepped forward, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Rest assured," he announced, his gaze sweeping over our board members. "This will not impact the timeline of our acquisition. We have already prepared for this transition. Mr. David Miller will be stepping into the role of interim head of legal affairs for this transaction. He has been fully briefed and will be able to sign all necessary documents without delay." David, a younger, less experienced lawyer, shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. The abruptness, the sheer brazenness of it, was breathtaking. They weren't just replacing me, they were openly flaunting their intent to bypass my previous refusal, to push this deal through using a more compliant signature. As the head of human resources discreetly guided me towards the door, away from the stunned faces, I felt a peculiar stillness descend upon me. My office was cleared within minutes, my personal effects packed into a few cardboard boxes. But as I walked out of that building, leaving behind 9 years of my life, I knew something they didn't. They thought I was gone. They thought my inconvenient integrity was now irrelevant. They didn't know I still held the only thing that mattered, the very foundation of their massive, crumbling deal. The drive home from Virion was strangely quiet. My mind wasn't racing with anger or despair, but with a cold, almost detached clarity. They had dismissed me, publicly humiliated me, believing they could simply replace my signature and proceed with their $2.5 billion deal. They saw me as an obstacle, easily removed. What they failed to see was that my value wasn't just in my presence, but in the meticulous history I had built, piece by painstaking piece, over nearly a decade. I walked into my apartment, moving with a deliberate slowness to my home office. It was a space few people knew about, a personal, independent archive where I had maintained copies of every critical legal document, every key decision, and every significant piece of correspondence that passed through my corporate office. This wasn't born of paranoia, but from a deep-seated professional habit. a belief that true compliance lay not just in signing papers, but in understanding their full historical context. It was my backup, my personal library of facts. I sat at my desk, the monitor's glow the only light, and navigated through the familiar directories of my personal server. It was like sifting through memories. I wasn't looking for proof against Gavin yet, merely confirming what I already knew. The foundation of Virian's legal structure, especially regarding major acquisitions, was deeply intertwined with my work. Then I found it, a series of early drafts of Virian's JAR corporate bylaws. I had spearheaded their drafting and implementation 7 years ago, a process involving painstaking negotiations. I vividly remembered one particular struggle, a lengthy debate over a seemingly obscure clause deep within the section governing changes of control and asset sales. This clause, which I had personally fought to include and ensure its precise wording, stipulated that all corporate acquisitions exceeding a specific financial threshold, a threshold the $2.5 billion deal vastly exceeded, absolutely required the final explicit authorization signature of the sitting head of legal compliance at the time of execution. There was more. It included a critical subclause stating, "This specific authority could not be redelegated or transferred to another individual within 6 months following any change in the head of legal compliance position." The implication was immediate, chillingly clear. They could fire me. They could bring in David Miller or anyone, but under their own governing documents, forged with my own oversight, no one else had the legal authority to sign that $2.5 billion acquisition contract for a full 6 months after my departure. The company had essentially written itself into a corner, unknowingly creating a legal loop that could not be easily broken. This wasn't some hidden email or secret recording. This was Virian's own foundational rulebook, publicly filed, easily accessible, and legally binding. They had dismissed the architect of their very legal framework, not realizing she had built in a failsafe, a quiet thread no one had expected to pull. I didn't feel a surge of triumph, only a quiet, resolute understanding. They were so consumed by ambition, so convinced of their power to simply erase me, that they had overlooked the very rules they operated by. My signature wasn't just on the acquisition contract. It was, in a very real sense, woven into the fabric of Virian itself. It wasn't a secret. It was just forgotten until now. Days turned into a week, then 2. Life outside Virian had a strange, almost surreal calm to it. My routine had shifted, the relentless pace replaced by a quiet introspection. I wasn't actively seeking to disrupt their $2.5 billion deal. I simply existed, holding on to the knowledge of their critical oversight. I knew the legal loop they were caught in, thanks to the corporate bylaws I had meticulously helped craft. It was a waiting game, and patience had always been one of my strongest suits. Then, an unexpected thread connected me back to their world. It came in the form of an email, not from Virian's official channels, but forwarded by Noah Clark. Noah was a software engineer, bright and principled, someone who had witnessed my public dismissal. We hadn't been close, but we shared a mutual respect born from countless late nights in the office, silently ensuring the integrity of complex projects. His brief message simply said, "Thought you might want to see this." Something felt off. The email he forwarded was an internal communication from Virian's Human Resources Department, sent to all senior-level employees. The subject line was innocuous: urgent, HR record updates. The body of the email requested that all recipients provide a scanned copy of their original employment contracts for a mandatory audit and update of personnel files. It was a rushed, almost desperate-sounding directive, unusual for a company typically so organized. My mind immediately clicked. They were looking for something. They were searching for a loophole, a hidden clause in someone else's contract that might override the very bylaws I had just confirmed in my personal archive. They were scrambling to find a way to legitimize a signature other than mine on that massive acquisition deal. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a cold confirmation of their panic. I didn't need to dig through old office files. My own employment contract, like all my vital legal documents, was stored securely at home, part of that meticulous personal archive. I retrieved the document, its familiar pages feeling substantial in my hands. I went directly to the section regarding intellectual property and, more importantly, to the clauses outlining my specific powers and responsibilities as head of legal compliance. And there it was, crystal clear. Not only the clause protecting my intellectual contributions to the company, but also the very specific, non-transferable authority granted to me as head of legal compliance for transactions exceeding a certain value. It was embedded, ironclad, precisely as I remembered. This clause, which I had personally ensured was included and approved by the board years ago, reiterated that my explicit authorization was indispensable for any deal of this magnitude. Crucially, it echoed the corporate bylaws. This specific authority could not be redelegated or transferred to another individual within 6 months of my departure. Their desperate search for a way around my signature was leading them directly back to the very agreements they had signed with me. They were hoping to find a path, but they were actually tightening the knot around their own necks. Noah's small, quiet act of sending that email had inadvertently confirmed their growing desperation. They were trying to find a solution, but the solution was actually the problem. They were looking for a loophole. They just walked right into the one I'd already built. The realization from Noah's email, confirming their frantic search for a workaround, brought no sense of triumph. Only a deepening calm. They were trapped by their own rules I had helped forge. The knowledge of their impending predicament settled in me not as a desire for revenge, but as a quiet, professional resolve. My next move wouldn't be about public accusations or desperate pleas for reinstatement. It would be about securing the integrity of my work, and by extension protecting the principles I believed in. I contacted my personal lawyer, a sharp, understated woman named Sarah Chen, whom I'd trusted for years with all my private legal matters. I didn't need to elaborate on the emotional toll of my dismissal. She understood the corporate landscape. I simply laid out the facts, the $2.5 billion buyout, my mandatory signature, the overlooked clause in Virian's own bylaws, and my employment contract. When I finished, there was a brief silence on her end. Then, her voice, crisp and clear, cut through the quiet. "Eleanor, that changes the entire legal calculus." Under her guidance, we began a quiet process. It wasn't about litigation, not yet. It was about solidifying my position, about ensuring that the foundational documents I had created, the very ones Virian was now struggling against, were unequivocally linked to me, beyond any dispute. We established a private entity, a holding company under a neutral name, Eastcliff Holdings. This wasn't a shell company for shady dealings. It was a legitimate legal vehicle designed to formally hold and manage certain intellectual assets and historical legal documentation. Into Eastcliff Holdings, I transferred the legal ownership of the original corporate bylaws drafts, complete with my annotations and the detailed amendment history of the non-transferable authority clause. This wasn't about owning Virian's documents, but about establishing an undeniable, traceable link between my work, my expertise, and the legal framework they were now desperately trying to circumvent. This was my quiet act of establishing an undeniable truth, creating a formal record that could not be easily erased. Meanwhile, back at Virian, the attempts to proceed with the $2.5 billion deal. Without my signature, or with David Miller's hastily acquired one, continued. I received no direct communication from them, but I heard whispers through professional channels. The acquiring conglomerate's legal team, meticulous in their own right, was raising increasingly pointed questions. They weren't just accepting the new interim lawyer, they were scrutinizing the sudden change, probing the circumstances. The missing piece in their meticulously assembled puzzle, my original signature, was becoming a glaring void. They were trying to force a square peg into a round hole. They thought simply replacing me was enough, that a new name on the dotted line would magically legitimize a flawed process. But the very structures I had helped build, the quiet, precise words I had woven into their foundation, were beginning to work against them. They were still chasing a signature. I was building a new foundation. The world outside Virian continued to spin, but the currents beneath its surface were shifting. I remained in my quiet, new routine, Eastcliff Holdings now a formally established entity, a testament to my foresight. I wasn't waiting for a specific event, but for the inevitable logic of the situation to unfold. They still needed that $2.5 billion deal. And without my proper authorization or a legal workaround that simply didn't exist, they were in a bind. Patience was my strongest ally. My quiet observation was soon broken by Sarah, my lawyer. She informed me that the acquiring conglomerate's legal team was growing increasingly agitated. The meticulously crafted facade of Virian's seamless transition was beginning to crack under their scrutiny. They weren't just asking questions, they were demanding answers about the sudden change in leadership for such a critical legal function. The real shift came during what was supposed to be a final high-level video conference. I wasn't privy to the call directly, of course, but the details filtered back through my network, confirmed by Sarah's own contacts within the legal community. Gavin, typically suave and in control, was leading the presentation for Virian. He was mid-sentence, confidently outlining the revised terms, when a sharp, clear voice cut him off. It belonged to Anya Sharma, the lead counsel for the acquiring conglomerate. Anya was renowned for her surgical precision in negotiations, her ability to dissect any argument down to its core. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't accuse. Her question was simple, direct, and devastating in its implications. "Mr. Lee," she began, her tone devoid of emotion, "we need a definitive clarification on the signatory authority for this acquisition. Our comprehensive records, established during initial due diligence, clearly indicate Eleanor Vance as the head of legal compliance with exclusive authorization. We've been informed she is no longer with Virian. Could you please confirm, unequivocally, who now holds the legitimate and singular legal authority to sign this $2.5 billion agreement? On behalf of Virian Analytics, ensuring its absolute validity under your own corporate bylaws?" The line went silent, a long, agonizing silence. Gavin, from what I heard, stumbled. He tried to pivot, to deflect, to re-emphasize the seamless transition and introduce David Miller again. But Anya Sharma wasn't interested in rhetoric. She pressed him calmly, persistently, demanding to know how precisely Virian intended to satisfy the explicit requirement for a head of legal compliance's signature, given the recent personnel change and the specific clauses within their own foundational documents. It was the quiet thread that had finally been pulled. Not by me, not by any dramatic accusation, but by the very system designed to protect the truth. The rules they tried to rewrite were now rewriting their own fate. Silence. And in that silence, I knew the thread had finally been pulled. The silence that followed Anya Sharma's question during that video conference was, in its own way, louder than any shouting match. It confirmed what I already knew. The foundation of their $2.5 billion deal was crumbling. My phone remained quiet as it had for weeks, but the world around Virian Analytics certainly wasn't. Whispers grew into murmurs, then into full-blown professional gossip across the industry. The prestigious acquisition was hitting an unexpected, insurmountable legal snag. Then the emails started, not from Gavin directly, but from his proxies, legal counsel, external consultants, even a board member I once respected. The tone was always the same, carefully polite, almost conciliatory, but with an underlying desperation. They were trying to reach me, to resolve the issue. The offers began subtly, hinting at a generous severance package beyond my original contract, then escalating to a senior advisory role with Virian, even suggesting a large, one-time payment to assist with a smooth transition of historical knowledge. They desperately needed me to either sign, or at the very least, implicitly validate a substitute signature. I read each email with the same cool detachment I'd used to dissect complex contracts. There was no emotion, no satisfaction, just a quiet reaffirmation of their panic. They were trying to buy time, buy silence, buy legitimacy, but what they truly needed, they could not buy. My integrity was not for sale, and neither was the principle of adhering to the rules they themselves had established. My response was a single, precise action. I forwarded each of these emails to Sarah Chen, my personal lawyer, with a brief, unemotional instruction. Please route future communication through formal channels. That was it. No long explanations, no accusations, no demands. Just a clear, unwavering boundary. It was the only reply they would receive from me. The impact was swift. Sarah, through her legal firm, informed Varian that any future discussions would need to be formally addressed to my legal representation, not to me directly, and would only proceed under a strict framework of legal compliance. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. The quiet refusal on my part sent ripples. The acquiring conglomerate, already wary after Anya Sharma's pointed questions, escalated their concerns. They sent an official notice to Varian, a legal document stating their intention to pause all activities related to the $2.5 billion acquisition until the issue of signatory authority was definitively resolved. The tone was professional, but the message was unmistakable. The deal was on hold indefinitely. They were trying to buy time, but time was the one thing they no longer controlled. The official notice from the acquiring conglomerate, pausing the $2.5 billion acquisition, sent shockwaves through Varian. This wasn't just an internal hiccup. It was a public declaration of a severe problem, immediately picked up by financial news outlets. The market reacted swiftly. Varian's stock price, which had soared in anticipation of the deal, now began to slide. Investor calls turned from celebratory to frantic. I didn't need to be inside Varian to feel the tremor. My professional network, usually discreet, now buzzed with urgent inquiries. Everyone wanted to know what was happening. The narrative shifted from Eleanor Vance was let go to what exactly did Eleanor Vance know, and why did they dismiss her so suddenly? The speculation was rampant, fueling the internal chaos at Varian. The pressure mounted quickly on Gavin and the executive team. The board, composed of seasoned investors and industry veterans, was now facing a crisis of confidence. A hurriedly convened emergency board meeting was called. I could almost picture the scene, the tense faces, the hushed arguments, the growing realization that their ambition had blinded them to a fundamental flaw. During this meeting, the core of the problem finally surfaced. One board member, a pragmatic individual known for his financial acumen and keen eye for corporate governance, demanded a full review of all legal documentation pertaining to the acquisition, including Varian's own foundational corporate bylaws. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, driven by the immediate threat to their investments, and that's when it happened. The truth, carefully woven into the fabric of Varian years ago, finally unraveled itself. The specific clause I had championed, the one detailing the indispensable non-transferable authority of the head of legal compliance for transactions exceeding a certain value, was discovered. It stated unequivocally that this authority could not be redelegated or transferred for 6 months following a change in personnel. My firing just days before the $2.5 billion contract was to be signed by someone else was not just an unfortunate timing. It was a deliberate, blatant attempt to circumvent their own binding rules. The revelation was devastating. It exposed Gavin's reckless strategy, the desperation to push the deal through at any cost. It showed that my dismissal wasn't about restructuring, but about silencing an inconvenient truth. The pressure from the board and panicked investors became unbearable. The rules they tried to rewrite were now rewriting their own fate. The revelation of Varian's own brows. Corporate bylaws, exposed in that emergency board meeting, sent a tremor through the entire company. It wasn't a matter of opinion or interpretation. It was a clear violation of their own rules, meticulously documented and publicly accessible. The news quickly leaked, confirming the earlier speculation in the market. The official word came swiftly. Gavin Lee, the chief executive officer, had been relieved of his duties, effective immediately. It was a quiet termination, but the implications were deafening. Just as momentous was the follow-up announcement. Varian Analytics was officially wazij, withdrawing from the $2.5 billion acquisition deal. The public statement cited unforeseen complexities in the final stages of due diligence and differences in strategic vision. But everyone in the industry, from the junior analysts to the seasoned private equity partners, knew the real reason. The deal hadn't just stalled, it had imploded because Varian couldn't legally complete it without the signature of the very person they'd so brazenly dismissed. The acquiring billionaire's firm, known for its unwavering commitment to ethical practices, released its own brief statement. It didn't mention Varian by name, but the message was clear. Transparency and integrity are non-negotiable prerequisites for all our partnerships and investments. It was a quiet, damning endorsement of the principles I had stood for, a public validation that required no fanfare from me. Varian's stock price plummeted, mirroring the collapse of their most anticipated deal. What was once a soaring ambition now faced a severe crisis of investor confidence. The dream of a massive buyout had vanished, leaving behind only the cold reality of a tarnished reputation and a leadership vacuum. I watched it unfold from a distance, with the same calm detachment I'd maintained throughout. There was no personal vindication, no desire to gloat. The system, built on rules and logic, had simply run its course. For weeks, my phone had remained silent regarding my old company, but now it began to ring. These weren't calls from Varian. These were calls from other companies, from reputable legal firms, from private equity giants. They weren't offering me a job. They were offering something far more significant, an invitation to consult, an acknowledgement of a different kind of value. The silence they tried to impose was now deafening them. The corporate world is a vast, complex machine, and Varian's public implosion was merely a ripple in its ocean. For me, however, it was the definitive end of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another. The phone calls I'd been receiving weren't about traditional employment. They were different. They recognized something beyond a resume, a value beyond a title. They recognized the power of unyielding integrity. Just months after my dismissal, I found myself on a brightly lit stage, not in a corporate boardroom, but at a major legal and compliance conference. I wasn't there as Eleanor Vance, the former head of legal compliance from Varian, but as the founder and chief executive officer of One Eastcliff Holdings. This new entity wasn't a law firm, nor was it a traditional consultancy. It was a pioneering platform for legal advisory and risk management, built on the very principles I had always championed: absolute transparency and the irrefutable traceability of every document, every clause, every decision. I didn't speak of Varian, didn't delve into the specifics of my past. My presentation focused on the critical importance of foundational legal integrity in an increasingly complex business world. I spoke of prevention, of foresight, of building systems that protect companies from their own potential blind spots. My concluding words resonated. The most powerful signature isn't the one they force you to give, it's the one that remembers the truth. Eastcliff Holdings quickly became an indispensable partner for major corporations, and notably, for the very conglomerate led by the billionaire who had almost acquired Varian. They became my first and arguably most important client. Other companies seeking to avoid the kind of catastrophic legal missteps that had derailed Varian soon followed. I never returned to traditional corporate employment. Instead, I built an empire, founded not on a desire for revenge, but on the simple, immutable fact that the truth, meticulously documented, always prevails. They fired me, thinking they owned the deal. But my signature, the only thing that mattered, was already signing something far, far bigger.